Well, welcome again here on Pentecost Sunday. I love this day. It's the day we get to take out all our red stuff, our red paraments and red decorations, put all the fire things around. It's when we get to go through, it's when I usually would punish all the readers by having to learn the names of Cappadocia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene. Apparently, the other parts of Libya nobody cares about. They don't count. And this is such a hopeful piece of the Bible, right? So optimistic. You know, where Jesus's disciples have been sitting there in this upper room waiting now for about 10 days, just sitting there waiting. So you got the disciples, Jesus' mom, Mary Magdalene, and then it says, and some others who had followed. So there's probably more than 12. You're probably talking more like 20 or something like that. So it's a big upper room where they're all sitting at in Jerusalem. And Jesus had said to them, after he descended, he said, go back to Jerusalem and wait for me, and I will send the advocate, and the advocate will come to you. And they were just supposed to sit there and wait. And I give them credit for being able to just sit for 10 days, not knowing how long they were going to sit. And they didn't even have Candy Crush to play on their phones. All they had was each other, like the good old days. And then it says, of course, that the Spirit comes and descends upon them with tongues like fire, or tongues as of fire. So it's not literally fire, but what it literally looked like, we don't know. And then it says they all started talking in different languages, or at least whatever they were talking, all the people who knew different languages down on the street could understand them. And I'm struck every time I read this how it doesn't say what they actually said. It doesn't, I always preached this. I've always preached this as, oh yes, and I've always preached this as, all these people were in Jerusalem and they didn't know about Jesus. And then the Spirit came, and they all preached about Jesus. No, I think I'll still put my money on that, but it doesn't say they actually talked about Jesus. It just said they heard the disciples speaking in their own language. I mean, for all we know, the guy from the part of Libya belonging to Cyrene was just sitting there, and it was like, if you would like to fix a wagon wheel, make sure that you bend the wood for 3 days before you turn it. I don't know what they said, but it doesn't matter. Because the disciples, it doesn't in a sense matter, because what seems to matter to the people is that God had given the disciples the gift to communicate with them. That here they were in a place where they didn't know the language. They were from a foreign place, parts of the Roman Empire, some were even to the east of there. And now suddenly they heard their own language. And if you've ever been in another country where you have to try to speak another language all the time, you learn it gets pretty exhausting really quick. You go to bed exhausted every night trying, because everything is work. And if you're fumbling around and you don't know the language at all and you're at everybody's mercy, you feel like kind of an idiot. That's one of the things I learned going to a foreign country, is the best way to adapt is to be prepared to look like an idiot for about a year. But if you are, that's the best way to learn, because then you put yourself out there and you try. But you can imagine all these pilgrims from all around Rome had come to Jerusalem because the Feast of Pentecost was a harvest festival. And I know it seems odd in the spring to be a harvest festival, but here in Arizona we kind of understand that. You don't plant in the summer, things burn up. You plant in the fall, through the winter, right? Well, either way, they had all come to Jerusalem for this festival. And what a huge relief it must have been to finally hear their own language again. To finally hear that somebody out there cares about the part of Libya belonging to Cyrene and Pamphylia, etc., etc. So this story isn't as much a story about conversion per se. They already were believers. They were Jewish. They hadn't heard about the gospel, but it is more a story of how the Holy Spirit gave the disciples the tools to speak to people in their own language, to communicate with people they wouldn't otherwise communicate with. And there's a lot of takeaways one can get from this story, but that's the one I want to sit on a little bit today. The Spirit gives us the ability to speak to people we otherwise couldn't, to communicate with people we otherwise couldn't. The Spirit gives us the ability. We don't learn this through techniques and trainings. We don't get it at a conference with a smooth-talking guy with a mic that goes around here who wears an untucked shirt and knows all the current slang and can tell you how to, increase your returns. It comes to us from the Spirit after waiting and praying in community, which isn't much of a formula. It won't sell much of a conference. The Wait and Pray Conference. Come and join me at my conference. We'll all gather together at the Omni, sit in a room, and wait there until the Spirit comes. No phones. I'm sure it would sell out in a heartbeat, right? That's kind of the essence of the Shakers and the Quakers, right? They didn't call it worship services, they called them meeting houses. And they would just sit there literally in silence and wait for the Spirit to move someone. And it didn't always move someone. So you could sometimes just sit and wait. But that's what it says, that after the Spirit comes to us, after waiting and praying in community. And that's what happened to the disciples. They didn't have an action plan. They didn't have prepared messages. They weren't versed in assessing felt needs. They didn't know marketing. They didn't know how to win friends and influence people. I have a feeling if you would have met the disciples, a bunch of them would have been really bad at winning friends and influencing people. They were just men and women who Jesus had gathered together, who believed that he was the Messiah and that the Spirit would come and show them the way. And the simplicity of it all is what I always have to remind myself and go back to. That Christianity did not start with programs, and it didn't start with even charismatic personalities. It started with outpourings of the Spirit on ordinary people who didn't know what to say or how to say it, but they let the Spirit put words in their mouth. After waiting and praying in community. Which brings my thoughts always back to evangelism today, in the 21st century in America. We all know it's not as easy as it used to be to grow a church. I mean, heck, when this place was started, I was not here when it was started. I cannot take credit for that. But back in the 90s, the planting pastor, he went door to door through the neighborhood, knocked on doors, and was able to find enough people to get a congregation together to worship in a year, and to get enough people and enough money together to build this building in 6 years. That is an impressive accomplishment. That's impressive. And it worked largely because there were a lot of people who were Christian who moved to this area. It was growing and new. I mean, it's still growing farther out. And with all the stories of changed lives, correct me if I'm wrong, those of you who were here 25 years ago, I don't think most of our new members were atheists who were converted to Christianity at the door knock and then decided to come to church after converting. There were, without doubt, amazing stories of the gospel at work. So it's not illegitimate, but our time is different, and we know this. We can tell when, I can tell when my kids go to school that most of their friends are either anti-religion or they're fundamentalist. There isn't a whole lot else. And most are of the no religion at all. Or they'll just say, I'm not religious. Like religious is a lifestyle choice, like, some other lifestyle choice. I'm not goth or whatever. And so simply coming and knocking on their door with a bright smile isn't going to get that person who thinks organized religion is the opiate of the masses to come to my church, no matter how charming I might be. You know, it would be kind of like if some, I don't know, a Buddhist monk or an imam showed up at my door. They could be wonderful, wonderful people, but I don't share the belief. So no matter how nice that imam is, I'm not going to the mosque because I don't share the beliefs. Knocking on my door won't change the belief. So to grow a church, most of the time in America, most church growth is collecting people who already believe. Usually when they move into town or if they go to another church. And more these days, it's even becoming collecting believers who share your political ideology, right? People will ask that. Who did you vote for in the election? And there are ways, of course, there are ways that work really well for that. And some pastors are very good at it. And God bless them. You know, they do great ministry. But I have never felt that just collecting believers was our calling. I don't feel like I went into ministry so that I could out-pastor that pastor, so that I could out-program that church's programs. I went into this to share the gospel and to build up and support the church that's here and the people of the church. So part of ministry is taking care of the church, and part is trying to reach people with the gospel who haven't heard, who don't believe, who have issues with organized religion. But that's not easy work. It's a lot of investment in a lot of people over a long time for very low yield. You know, it's going out into the community and meeting people and building relationships and spending time investing in those relationships to build the trust where you can have those honest conversations about faith, and having to sit and listen to endless hours of questions about crusades and inquisitions and priest abuse scandals, and then maybe after years of trying to live a different way and demonstrate it, they might reconsider. And that's not how you're going to put numbers on the board quickly. When the synod calls and asks, how many new members did you get this year? But yet, the early church was able to grow a lot, with lots of converts, without programs, without knocking on doors, without social media. None of them were trained at it. What did they do? They just dove right in, head first, being led by the Spirit. They didn't know how. They let the Spirit show them the way. And we think that most Christian communities in the early church were actually not very big. We think most of them were maybe 50 people tops. Paul's church in Corinth that gets 2 books of the Bible, yeah, maybe 50 when they all gathered together. But what they did have was this sort of crazy faith that if they waited and prayed together, the Holy Spirit would show them the way and give them the tools. And it worked. It was not an easy road. Read the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It did not always go smoothly. In fact, most of the time it wasn't smoothly. But ultimately it grew in God's time. And this is where I always say it's important not to lose hope as a church. As the culture keeps shifting and becoming more and more secular, growth is harder. And we don't always have to try to learn a special trick. I think we got to lean back a little bit more on the old ways and trust that the Spirit will get us there. That the Spirit will give us the words to say. The Spirit will show us how to connect with someone new, someone from a different culture or a different country or a different side of the freeway. The Spirit will give us guidance when we step out in faith to make disciples and change lives and make a difference in the world. And I believe that once you start making a difference in people's lives, and they have those stories of their life being changed, they start talking, and then the gospel spreads. It might not spread in the way you wanted, in the direction you planned, but it spreads, and it spreads in God's way. And the Spirit shows you how. Little memory lane here. I'm pretty sure I told this story before, but I'm also pretty sure it was long enough ago that none of you remember it. It came to me by, it wasn't even one I experienced. It was a former missionary to Africa, and this was years ago, and he was told it by a pastor in the U.S. So we're already a few steps removed, right? But it was really about the Spirit. So there was this pastor in, I don't know, some big city. I don't remember which one. And he had been preaching week after week. When the Spirit calls you, you go. When the Spirit says, you act. If the Spirit says, get up, you do it. And he'd been up here at his pulpit preaching that over and over. And then he wakes up in the middle of the night. And the Spirit says, go down to the red light district and preach to the teenage prostitutes. And he woke up. And I think some of his, his counselor was like, are you sure you really want to do this? There's, risks involved in this kind of work. I have to practice when I preach, he said. Spirit said. So he throws on his collar so they know why he's there. Goes down and starts preaching. Well, after a few months of going down regularly, they start to get to know the guy. He's got some rapport. He's got some trust with them. So eventually they ask, where's your church? And he gives them the address, such and such whatever place. Doesn't think anything of it. Standing up there one Sunday, preaching like me, suddenly in the middle of the service, half dozen young women start walking down the aisle. They were late. They didn't get the service time correct, and they had just gotten off work. And they were dressed in their work clothes. And they marched down, of course, being a church that we'll assume this wasn't a confirmation Sunday. What row is always open? The front row. So they walked right down to the middle and plopped down in the front row and got up. So the pastor then given his announcements. All right, we got, potluck over at Judy's place, progressive dinner, someone needs to do coffee. All right, anyone want to sign up for the youth retreat? We got a youth retreat. Girls start chit-chatting with each other. They raise their hands. We want to go on the youth retreat. Great, pastor's thinking, the Spirit's at work. So he signs them up, comes home. An hour later, the phone rings. It's the board president. The mothers of all the teenage boys have called and said they're quitting the church if those girls are at the youth retreat. And what a lesson, hard lesson the pastor had in following where the Spirit goes. I mean, my first reaction is, you really think that after having to spend a whole night doing what no teenager should ever have to do, the one thing they want to do is go on a youth retreat and corrupt your clearly uncorrupted son? That's what they're after? Because none of that happens at the high school. But this is what he found. He followed the Spirit, but not everyone was ready to follow it. Because the Spirit was blowing one way. The Spirit was saying, and so then they negotiated, and I think one suggestion was they can have their own youth retreat. We'll have separate but equal retreats. Yeah, great. What a good message that sends. And I don't ever remember how it ended, whether he lost his job or had to do something else, bring a bunch of chaperones. I don't know how it ended. But it's always kind of one of those stories that reminds me of, when God sends the Spirit sends you places. And the funny thing is, those girls are exactly the kind of people Jesus hung out with himself, over and over and over. Even for the most literalist in the world. Why are you hanging out with sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors? The Spirit will show you. You just have to be willing to run with it. You have to get out there. Because the Spirit, for most of us, is not going to drag us out of bed. And the Spirit's definitely not going to force us like a zombie to go where the place is. We do have to put ourselves out there a little bit. We do have to use our own will. But the answers can be found, I think they will be found, more and more in our new world. and encounters between believers and the world guided by the Spirit. It will show you what to do. It will give you the words to say. It will teach you the language. It will cross that bridge for you. The Spirit will make it possible. Amen.